We are indeed the thinkers who think the thoughts. And oh, what a room full of thinkers this is. Now, I think some of you probably have been looking at this poster as you've seen it around here for the last week or so. And you might even have guessed that I'm going to be talking about stories today. And if that's where you landed in terms of trying to figure out what this one was all about, you are absolutely right. I am going to talk about stories because our stories are vitally important to us. Danish writer and storyteller Isaac Dennison said, "To be a person is to have a story to tell." To be a person is to have a story to tell. And of course, she told us her story in the book Out of Africa, which was later adapted for the highly acclaimed film of the same name. Beautiful film. So, to be a person is to have a story to tell. And as human beings, we're just all wired for stories. We all have stories. Our stories can define us, or they can inform us. And when we understand what they're telling us, and more importantly, are open to learning from them, then we can write new endings. And if we write a new ending for ourselves, then we can live happily and wholly ever after. So here we go. Once upon a time, two college friends went out west for a little camping trip on one of their breaks. And one morning they were awakened to the sound of a bear crashing through their campsite in search of food. Now, one friend grabbed his car keys and his cell phone. The other one grabbed his duffel bag and was shaken all out, grabbed his running shoes. The camper with the cell phone said, "Dude, you are never going to outrun that bear." The guy with the running shoes just kept lacing them up, didn't even look up, said, "I don't have to outrun the bear. I simply have to outrun you." So once upon a time, most of our stories had their roots in survival. Our ancestors who went out seeking dinner needed to make sure that they didn't inadvertently become dinner. And that's kind of a twist on this whole idea that which you are seeking is also seeking you. So the fact that we are all here today speaks volumes to the ability of our ancestors to outrun that which was larger and faster than them, and to the abilities of the others to learn from those stories and to adapt. Now, our physical survival instinct, that split-second fight, flight, or freeze decision-making, it's one of the ways that our brains are wired for stories. Now, the brain doesn't always have all the facts when it has to make those split-second decisions. And so sometimes it simply connects the dots and it fills in the gaps as best it can. And it has to do that because those decisions have to be made. Emotionally, we also make fight, flight, or freeze decisions. And even though emotional survival is controlled by a completely different region in the brain, those old habits of ours die hard. So in the physical survival game, the brain works on autopilot. Stories just happen. When it comes to emotional survival, our hearts often jump in to co-author the story that our head is making up. And so we are meaning-making entities, filling in the gaps, making stuff up, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, and sometimes we get it wrong. Now, Steve and I have a great example of how we can fill in the gaps and connect the dots to make meaning out of what we are experiencing. It's an oldie but a goodie, I think a lot of you will know this. It's one of those, crank down the window, turn up the radio really loud, sing out loud kind of things. So we're going to need your help on this one. And you don't have to stand up to sing this one, but I want you to sing loud and with enthusiasm. And you did just fine on the last song, so we're going to be fine on this one too. So I want you folks on this side of the room to sing really loud on the first part of the line, and you folks over here to sing really loud on the second part of the line. And you'll see when that happens. And if it's not clear that there's a first part and a second part, well, then just everybody sing real loud, okay? Steve?
Took a walking past your house late last night. All the shades were pulled and drawn way down tight. From within the dim light cast two silhouettes on the shade. Oh, what a lovely couple they made. Put his arms around your waist, held you tight, kisses I could almost taste. In the night, wondered why I'm not the guy whose silhouettes on the shade. I couldn't hide the tears in my eyes. Silhouette, 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 oh, silhouette, 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 oh, oh.
Oh, you did good on that. You did good on that. So, does anybody remember how the story ends in the song? He wasn't standing outside of his girlfriend's house, was he? No, he was on the wrong street. He had the right house number, but he was on the wrong street, so his girlfriend wasn't stepping out on him at all. But there he was, poor baby, looking at silhouettes on the shade, and he couldn't hide the tears in his eyes because of the story he'd made up, right? Okay. So we do get it wrong from time to time, but it never seems to stop us. Our brain is constantly scanning stored data from past situations to find something that can explain our current experience. And if it comes up empty-handed, well, then it just fills in the blanks, and just like that, we have ourselves a story. So obviously, it's a very simple explanation for a very complex process that's going on here. But perhaps I can illustrate this with a story for you. So, once upon a time, a fair-haired young girl was born in the city of Kars in the land of the Great Lakes. Her parents had been married for several years, and they were eager for the birth of their first child. She was welcomed warmly, loved unconditionally, and she was their only child for over 6 years. Now, she was the center of their attention, and she was the center of their world. And practically speaking, she was also the only grandchild for almost as long. Now, she had some cousins, 3 of them. But they lived way beyond the western boundaries of the city of Kars. And those 3, very young, very close in age, very active, and their parents really didn't travel very far with them at all. So we didn't get to see those cousins too much, So there she was, the center of attention, the apple of everyone's eye, and her life could not have been better. But into this happy land came an invader. And then another one right behind it. More cousins. And these cousins, they lived right around the corner. And then the invasion of the siblings. And pretty soon, there were siblings, there were cousins, there were schoolmates. The whole land was just overrun with all of these kids. And the little fair-haired girl was vastly outnumbered. And instead of being the only one, she became just one of many. Now, I know that you're thinkers, and I know you've kind of figured this out, but her story was my story. It is my story. And when my cousins and when my siblings were born, and it all kind of happened all at once, after being the only one for such a long time, well, my loss was something that I didn't even know how to describe. I certainly didn't have the emotional skills and the maturity to deal with it. So whatever loss, whatever sadness I was feeling about that whole thing, it simply got buried and passed over in the busyness of everyday life. But what happened was that when I couldn't be the only one, I didn't know who I was. And losing that position as the only one left me lost for a long, long time. So, like most kids, like all of you, as babies and children, we all go through this process, which is a trial and error way of trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work in terms of getting what we want and what we need from the adults in our lives. And the behaviors that get results for us, well, those just become entrenched in our little personalities. And the ones that don't kind of get relegated off to the shadows. We end up building an entire repertoire of behaviors that help us get what we want, and we continue to hide little pieces of ourselves in the shadows when they don't seem to fit with our formula for success. Our formula for getting what we want is one of our stories. And it's a story that's made up of stories. So when children struggle to understand the big changes in their world, they often think that they're to blame for what has happened. So they start rewriting their little formulas for success in an effort to put things back the way they were. And there was a part of me that was longing for all of that attention and acceptance that I had experienced from the adults in my world when I was the only one. So what came to me was this. If I was a really good kid, if I was a really good student, if I was a really good big sister, well, then maybe things would go back like the way they were before. And, if I couldn't be the only one, well, then maybe I could be number one. And that kind of worked out for a while. Life was good. I was good. Parents and grandparents were praising my good grades and all of my accomplishments. Bosses promoted me. And things kind of went on like that for quite a while. The little pieces that were hidden off in the shadows, the reservoir of grief that had been created when I was just 6 or 7 years old, it stayed hidden and buried for a long, long time. But as we grow older, whatever is hidden, whatever is buried, these are the things that become the tales that we tell ourselves and the stories that we tell to the world. Steve?
If you could read my mind, love, what a tale my thoughts could tell. Just like an old-time movie about a ghost from a wishing well. In a castle dark or a fortress strong, with chains upon my feet, you know that ghost is me. and I won't ever be set free as long as I'm a ghost that you can't see. I won't ever be set free as long as I'm a ghost you can't see.
Those little pieces of ourselves that we relegate to the shadows are the ghosts that we can't see. And we will never be set free. We will be bound up in and bound by our stories until we're really willing to listen to them and hear what they're telling us. Until we're really willing to learn from them instead of merely reliving them. In his book, Finding Yourself in Transition, Robert Brummett writes that a primary law of consciousness is that which is hidden will someday be revealed. The patterns of thinking, feeling, and behavior that once existed to serve us and protect us may now keep us in bondage. So whatever we came up with to serve us, to protect us, may now actually be the source of those chains. The parts of me that had been relegated to the shadows, the ghosts that I couldn't see, well, they began showing up in the workplace. And they showed up as irritations with and judgments about colleagues and coworkers. Now, I was not in outright conflict with my colleagues, but there was no peace in my heart. Let me tell you why. Nobody cared as much as I did. Nobody worked as hard as I did. I was running circles around that guy in the next office, and my boss didn't even notice. Now, some of you know what that tape sounds like, and the rest of you, I'm sure you don't want to hear it. So we'll just hit the stop button right there for now, okay? But maybe it was coincidence, and maybe it was just simply synchronicity. But those ghosts in the workplace started showing up about the same time that I started to get involved with Unity. And the more that I studied Unity's teachings, the more I realized that something in my consciousness was way out of balance. Something was way out of sync. And for sure, something was way out of character with my divine nature and the Christ in me. I knew that something was demanding my attention, but I just didn't know how to get a hold of it. Gary Simmons writes that if you are experiencing an adversary in your life, you are living out of a lesser purpose that supports your sense of separation. If you're experiencing adversaries in your life, you're living out of a lesser purpose that supports your sense of separation. Now, the word adversary struck me as a bit strong, but there's no way that I could deny that I was feeling at odds with certain people at work. And for sure, I was operating with this attitude of like hypervigilance, feeling like I needed to get it right all the time, every time. Ghost number one. I was always frustrated with somebody or something. Ghost number two. Somebody was always letting me down. Ghost number three. I'm right. You're wrong. Now, what I have since come to know and understand is that I was looking squarely at a series of projections that had their roots in my unmet needs, unresolved grief, unacknowledged fears. Charles Fillmore taught us that when man ignores the wisdom of spirit and proceeds to build his world independently, he seems to make many states and conditions that are not really made at all. They are merely malformations, and they must, of necessity, fall to pieces of their own disproportion. We make up stories. We create these states, these conditions, these malformations, and they must, of necessity, fall to pieces because of their disproportion. I think it's really interesting that Fillmore used the word malformations instead of the word projections. But then I went back and I thought about this and I looked at it, and Charles Fillmore wrote those words in 1895, a full 20 years before Carl Jung published anything on that subject, and 40 years before he came to America on his first lecture tour. So I think that, in retrospect, Fillmore's analysis was amazingly insightful and certainly God-inspired. So my perceptions were being created by this shadow self, and this is a story that I had created. If I can't be your only one or your number one, then I don't know who I am. And because my soul was yearning for integration, it was leading me right smack dab into those circumstances and those situations that were created by my shadow self, the sense of loss, the sense of separation, the malformations. It needed me to go there because that's where my path of healing was. And those are all the things that I had tried to do all myself, all by myself. So I made a decision to stop reliving my story and start listening to what it was telling me. And this is what I discovered when I listened deeply. Nothing had been taken from me. Nothing had been lost. The love and the affection and the attention that had been given to me as the only one, it simply had been given to others as well. There was no need for me to outperform any other child in order to have a place at the table. I was expected to do my best, but I didn't have to be the best. Nothing had been taken from me, and nothing had been lost. I don't have to outshine my colleagues. I didn't have to outmaneuver them. The only person who needed me to overachieve was me. And, I was irritated by people who weren't similarly driven, because they had the capacity to give themselves a break every now and then. And I just didn't think that that was something that I could afford to do. But in reality, nothing had been taken from me, and nothing had been lost. This idea of lost status, or perhaps a fall from grace, if you will, is really kind of the ultimate story. Adam's fall from grace, an exile from Eden. It's a story that we all share. But good news, there's also one other story that we all share. And it's the story of our reconciliation. It's the story that reminds us that nothing has been taken from us and nothing has been lost. In Paul's letter to the Romans, the subtitle for chapter 12 is The Call to Full Surrender. The call to full surrender. And in verse 2 of that chapter, Paul writes, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds." Be transformed by the renewing of your minds. You see, Paul perceived that the followers of Jesus represented a new order, an order that would overcome the futile thinking and the darkening of our minds. A new order that trumped our fallen nature. And in embracing the Spirit of Christ that's within each and every one of us, we have everything we need to live successfully, wholly, happily ever after. Paul is simply challenging us to be true to that Christ nature, to be true to ourselves. Because we are God expressing. And when we live from that truth, nothing can ever be taken from us, and nothing is ever lost. My soul was leading me away from futile thinking, the darkening of my mind, the situations and circumstances that needed to be healed. And I followed my soul's lead, and listening at depth to my big story finally gave me the power to write a new ending. Each and every person in this room has made some emotional survival decisions based on stories that we created, stories that we made up to fill in those missing pieces. And what I want to suggest to you is that those pieces were not and are not missing. Somewhere along the line, they were simply relegated to the shadows. They're out there. They're waiting for you to let them come home. They're waiting for you to open your arms and welcome them in. And when you do, you'll have an opportunity to use them to write a new ending. Now, because we are all seekers at heart and truth students on this journey, there's a little bit of homework that you might find helpful. It's optional, so. But maybe what you can do is pick one of your stories that's just been begging for a new ending. Resolve to stop reliving it and simply start listening to it. Listen with love. Listen deeply. And if you can hear what's missing, then maybe you can embrace it and welcome it home. And then if you want to, write yourself a new ending. So I'd like to close with this affirmation, and I'll say each line first, and then I'll invite you to repeat it after me. God in me is my true nature. Together. God in me is my true nature. God through me embraces my shadows. Together. God through me embraces my shadows. God as me writes new endings. Together. God as me writes new endings. And I think if we can have all three up there, let's just say it right from the top all the way through. God in me is my true nature. God through me embraces my shadows. God as me writes new endings. Thank you. God bless you all. Have an amazing week. And as we move into this time of meditation and prayer and reflection, I invite you to close your outer eyes, if it's comfortable for you to do that. And I invite you to make yourself comfortable in your seat. Just go ahead and place your back firmly against the seat and just allow the chair to support you. Plant your feet firmly on the floor and know that you are grounded and anchored in the truth of your being, in the God you are expressing. Set aside anything that might be in your lap or in your hands. And I also invite you to set aside your awareness of anything outside of this room, anything that is not present in this time and place. And as we make a conscious effort to quiet our minds and relax any tension or discomfort in our bodies, I invite you to turn your attention to your breath. We breathe in and we breathe out. And we are comforted by the gentle rhythm of that life energy that moves in and through us when we breathe. We breathe in and we breathe out. And we feel that life energy moving in and through us. Breathe in a breath of peace and breathe out any tensions or concerns. Breathe in a breath of joy and breathe out any sadness. Breathe in a breath of life and a breath of love. And breathe out any thoughts of separation. And so we breathe in and we breathe out, knowing that we are one with all of creation, earth below, stars above, and every aspect of creation that fills the space between. We breathe in a sense of oneness, and we breathe out any sense of separation. We breathe in oneness and breathe out separation. We are God expressing, and there is no separation. We are God expressing, and there is no separation. Separation is a story. It's a projection. It's a condition that we create. Separation hides our wholeness in the shadows. It's a malformation. It's a story that falls to pieces in the light of love. And so we are one with the one and one with all of creation. We are the universe that is becoming conscious of itself. We're stardust that has begun to contemplate stars. We are thinkers thinking thoughts. We are listening to our stories. We are reaching into the shadows. And we're loving ourselves back to the way it was once upon a time. We're loving ourselves back to the way we were once upon a time. And we can see ourselves once again for who we really are. Free from the shadows, reconciled and whole. We are remembering that we are God. And so I invite you now to let my words be your words as we take these thoughts into the silence. I am listening to my story. I am loving myself back to the way it was. I can see myself again for who I really am. And I remember that I am God. And I invite you to take that into the silence. And as you gently bring your awareness back to this room, we give thanks for the awareness of the story that God has written about us. Because in God's story, we are love, and we are lovable. We are blessed, and we are a blessing. We are whole, and we are holy. We are one with the One, and so it is, and so we let it be.